Okay, so we finished Shemot finally this week. The Shemot, as you know, the last several parshiot, the bulk of it has been dedicated to the building of the Mishkan. And as Hashem sets up already in the beginning of Parshas Truma, the end goal of the Mishkan is that God can dwell amongst the Jewish people. Right? He tells them, make a tabernacle, a sanctuary, so that I can dwell amongst the Jewish people. And that's the end goal. And every detail that we go through, whether it be the building of the vessels, or the building of the walls, or the sanctification of the Kohanim, or the clothes that they're going to wear, whatever it's going to be, right? It has all been aimed at this goal, at this moment. And Shemot ends on that note. But the end of Shemot is really quite difficult to understand. The culmination really does come as, or at least what we think it should do, right? Which is Vaychal Moshe et HaMilacha. So the Torah tells you that after all of these parshiot, Moshe finishes the work. He finishes the Mishkan. Vaychas Anan et Oel Moed Uflor Alei Malei Mishkan. And the cloud covers the Oel Moed, the tent of meeting, and God's presence, God's glory fills the Mishkan, which is what we've been waiting for. And as the Ramban notes, the Mishkan is meant to continue the experience of Har Sinai, and at Har Sinai as well, God's presence, whatever that means, was manifest in this cloud. So this is the moment we've been waiting for. But the next thing that we hear is V'lo yachol Moshe lavo al moed ki shachan alav ha'anan uv'chorem ha'malei ha'mishkan. But Moshe couldn't come in because the imminence of God was so intense in that cloud that Moshe can't even enter. And again, that highlights the parallel that you see from Har Sinai, which is what happened at Har Sinai also, right? You had that preliminary stage with thunder and lightning and clouds and fog and all the pyrotechnics of that moment. But Moshe wasn't allowed to actually enter Har Sinai until he was explicitly called. And this scene repeats itself a third time in our Haftorah. We don't actually read this Haftorah very often, right? The Haftorah of Pekudei, because the number of times that it's only Parshas Pekudei, and you're not reading Shkalim, and you're not reading Zachor, and you're not reading whatever other thing you're reading, right? That we actually read this Haftarah, it's not so often. But the Haftarah is from the sanctification, the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit HaMikdash under Shlomo, and there you have the same thing. There it's not Moshe, obviously, there it's the Kohanim, but again you have this presence of God which descends onto the Mikdash in such an intense and imminent way that the Kohanim can't enter until they are granted permission, and they stand outside, and the scene repeats itself. Sinai, Mishkan, Mikdash. But you're waiting at this moment for the next stage to happen, which is, okay, God is present, it's intense. Naturally, human beings, Moshe, the Kohanim, whoever it might be, isn't allowed to enter into that holy space. And then God says, come in, and he does, right? That's what's supposed to happen. But that's not what happens. The next pasuk just sort of cuts it off and moves to a different scene, right? If you were writing this in a book, this would be an absolutely terrible sentence structure or paragraph structure, right? Because the next pasuk should be, and God called Moshe into the Beit HaMikdash, into the Mishkan. Or he didn't call him, or whatever. There should be a continuation to this story. But it doesn't. It picks up in a totally different story. And it says, and when the cloud would lift from the Mishkan, the Jews would travel on all of their travels. Which has literally nothing to do with the previous pasuk. I mean, you could sort of miss it, right? Because the previous pasuk said the cloud descended on the Mishkan in such a way that Moshe couldn't enter. So you could say, okay, it's sort of parenthetical. And by the way, that cloud, which which has not yet in any way lost its intensity, and we have not yet reached a satisfactory conclusion. Moshe hasn't been allowed into the cloud. Right? It's a parenthetical comment, but by the way, with that cloud, which we haven't finished talking about, when it would lift, so it would act as the guide. Right? As soon as it lifted, the Jews knew it was time to move. But it's not parenthetical, because the next two psukim actually continue on this theme, which is V'im lo ya'aleh ha'anan v'lo yisu ad yom ha'aloto, and if the cloud wouldn't lift, so then they wouldn't travel until it would lift, right? It would just stay there. Ki anan Adonai al mishkan yomam ve'esh ti'elai labo le'nei kol Yisrael b'chol masehem, because the cloud of God was on the Mishkan during the day and the fire at night, to the eyes of the Jewish people in all of their travels. And now, okay, this is a parenthetical comment, you'd expect closed parentheses, and then God allowed him to come into the cloud. Except instead what you get is chazak, chazak, v'nid chazek, and the Sefer is over and we close the book. Right? And there is no continuation to this story in Shemot, which creates two problems. One is, where is the resolution to this, right, this cliffhanger? Does God let him in to the Mishkan? And the second is, well, wait a second, right? While I was reading it, I could sort of accept that this discussion of the Jews' travel plans, that they would travel if the cloud was moving, and they wouldn't travel if the cloud was at rest. I could accept that as a parenthetical comment if the parentheses closed and then you picked up on the regular story. But once it's not a parenthetical comment, because it never picks up in the story, you've got to say, okay, well, what was the point of it and where does it go? So this is one of my favorite shiurim I ever heard from Rabbi Liebtag, where he points out that, well, it's not totally true. There is a resolution to this, but it's not where you think it should be, right? Because obviously we just closed the book. It's done, right? That's 5 psukim, and now the book is over, and we, chazak, chazak, v'nid chazek, we moved on. But I could really take those 5 psukim, cut them up, and copy and paste in a place where it would make a lot of sense. And if you turn the page in your Chumash, right, and you open up next week's parsha, Vayikra, so there's actually a continuation to the story. Because the first pasuk of Vayikra is Vayikra el Moshe Vayidaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor, that God calls out to Moshe from the tent of meeting, saying Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem, etc. Speak to the Jewish people, which means that exactly what we expected to happen 3 psukim earlier, the end of Shemot, which is the cloud is there in its intensity, because this is supposed to be where God meets man, and therefore we just wait, right? Man stands in anticipation, waiting for God to actually reach out to him. That happens. That's called the first pasuk of Vayikra. But for some reason, God decides to, right, interrupt it with 3 psukim about travels which have nothing to do with it, and then close the book, and then only tell you the resolution to this story. It's like, right, you imagine a cliffhanger. It's strange, right? But the cliffhanger of Shemot, as it were, right? And this is, in order to recognize the cliffhanger, you have to remember that in the Torah, right, we think of it, people tend to think of the Torah in one of 2 ways. Either as one big book, or as parshiot, or maybe as psukim. But the truth is, according to Chazal, it's neither, right? It's the 5 books, right? What we call it, literally the 5 books. Right, the 5 books of Moshe, the 5 books of Moses, the 5 Chumashim. So really, these are 5 books. So this is like, volume whatever of Harry Potter closing on a cliffhanger, and volume 3 closing on a cliffhanger, and volume 4 picking up with the resolution of the cliffhanger. Right, this is essentially what God does. Shemot ends on a cliffhanger, and Vayikra opens. Yes, God let him in. Right, God called him. The strange thing is that it's not really how it works, because there was those weird 3 psukim afterwards about the travels. So then Rabbi that continued and said, well, those psukim actually also have a natural continuation. right? If we go back to those psukim were, right, when God's cloud lifted up, so then they would travel. When it didn't lift up, they would stay in place. That story picks up in a whole other book later, in volume 4 of the Torah, right? In Bamidbar, because that's how Bamidbar starts. Vayaver Adonai Moshe lemor, ve'al Moshe b'mar Sinai b'Omoed, v'chal ha'chol ha'sheni, v'shana sheni l'tzitzim mer t'Mitzrayim lemor, Se'u et Rosh Koladat, etc. And then it describes the camps and how they traveled. Meaning that story, how did the Jews travel through the desert, is picked up in Bamidbar. So Rehalim Pek says, if you look at the last 5 psukim of Shemot, and you get this fascinating bifurcation, right? You have 2 psukim that leave you on a cliffhanger about God's presence being imminent to the Mishkan and us waiting for God to reach out to Moshe from the Mishkan and invite him in. And then you get a totally different storyline about how God's presence in that cloud also acted to tell the Jews how they were traveling through the desert. And that storyline gets picked up in Bamidbar. Right? So what you actually have structurally is that Shemot ends with 2 cliffhangers, right, which divide into Vayikra and Bamidbar. Right? It's as if some of these very complicated novels to read, right? And there's 2 stories going on all at once, right? And you sort of hear them at the same time, and then eventually you hear them separately, right? There's a chapter, right? There's one narrative that happens, and then you slowly pull them out and show how the story's played out. If you've ever read Like Dreamers, it's sort of like this, right? They tell the story of the have you read Like Dreamers? Like Dreamers is an excellent book by Yossi Klein Halevi. It's a recount of the 6-Day War, and then it takes the lives of the paratroopers who freed Yerushalayim and follows them through their lives as microcosms of the changes that happened in Israeli society after the 6-Day War. One of the paratroopers, right, became a founder of Gush Emunim and founded the settler movement, and another one of them became a founder of Peace Now because he was so traumatized by the land that we conquered and kept during the 6-Day War that he devoted his life to trying to give it back. Right, you see all the trends that emerged even from those paratroopers. So the first 2 chapters of this, it's like it goes like the book structure is sort of like an hourglass, right? Everything comes together, right? You first meet all these personalities, and then they all come part of this unit and come together in this seminal moment in Israeli history, and then you follow their lives and you see different tales, right? So it's one climactic moment, right? That is the culmination of many stories, but also then continues to manifest in different stories. But there is that moment of meeting, which is essentially the last 5 psukim in Shemot. Right? The last 5 psukim in Shemot bring together all the themes that have been running through the Torah until now, and then they manifest themselves in different books, called Vayikra and Bamidbar. But what would that even mean, right? So, I sort of get it in Like Dreamers, right? That climactic moment was the conquering of Yerushalayim. And it brings together the stories of all these soldiers, and then follows them into their lives. So, but what exactly is going on in the Torah? So here, if you follow Shemot, right, the second half of Shemot especially, the second half of Shemot is the story of how God builds a relationship with and manifests Himself to the Jewish people, that starts in it starts really, obviously, in the first half of Shemot, in Yetziat Mitzrayim, where God introduces Himself to Moshe, and He says, right, I have not yet introduced myself as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. I've introduced myself as other names to the Avod, but I haven't introduced myself this way to the Avod. But I'm about to introduce myself in a radically different way to the Jewish people. And then He does that, right? He introduces Himself in that way. They learn to trust God through the Makot, through Yetziat Mitzrayim, through the Exodus, through the ensuing stories of the man and the water, where God is supporting them. And then it comes to its climax at Har Sinai. Right? God reveals Himself in a way He never has and never will. And He says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Tzatich Hamer Mitzrayim, and they speak to God face to face for that moment. And God says, here I am. And then, as the Ramban says, that moment is so incredibly powerful, is so incredibly overwhelming, is so seminal in the history of the Jewish people, that it needs to be commemorated. The fact that God reveals Himself in the overpowering, in the miraculous, in the overwhelming, transcendent / imminent, like this moment of needs to be commemorated, and that's in the Mishkan, right? And that's why the Ramban notes that we build the Mishkan to, as I mentioned, commemorate Har Sinai. Right? The Ramban notes that you have at Har Sinai, you had 3 levels of separation between God and the Jewish people. You had Moshe's level, and then you had Aaron's level, and then you had the Canaan's level, and then you had the Jewish people at the bottom of the mountain. And the Mishkan is set up the same way, where you have the Aaron, where only Moshe / the Kohen Gadol can enter, and then you have the Kohanim, and then you have the Ezra Yisrael, and the image of God's intense presence is that cloud, which is present in Har Sinai, is present at this moment, but also is present every year when the Kohen Gadol goes in, and as the Torah describes it, Ki be'anan Irael HaKaporah. When he goes into Yom Kippur, he comes in literally a cloud of smoke that he creates from the Ketoret, from the incense, right? And visually and structurally, the Mishkan is meant to capture that moment for eternity. That's one way that we meet God. But there's another way we meet God, right? Because not every part of life is this, is the Yom Kippur, Har Sinai, Mishkan, Mikdash, open miracles. Sometimes we meet God in the everyday, in the mundane, right? Sometimes we just, God tells us what to do, and we do it, and we feel God guiding us through our life, right? Taking care of us in the less miraculous and less fabulous and the less earth-shattering, in all the other ways that we talk about God, right? So if Shemot is the story of how God builds His relationship with the Jewish people, there have to be 2 stories told there. One is, how does God meet us in the miraculous and the imminent and the intense? And how does God meet us in the regular and the mundane and the everyday? So the second half of Shemot, right, gets us to that moment. It tells us there was Har Sinai, and then God said, I want you to commemorate Har Sinai and by building a Mishkan. So Shemot Tzava, we go through every detail of the Mishkan and explain exactly what it's going to look like and what do you need to do to commemorate that moment in a way that God will be willing to come down into this home and be among you. And then we have a very unwanted break in Kitisa, which is that whole dream was almost destroyed when we sinned at the Egel. And God said, forget it, I'm done, right? I'm sorry I ever built this relationship with you. And Moshe says, don't do it. Right? We talked this about a few weeks ago, right? Don't do that to us, right? We wanted this relationship with you, and there's that negotiation of Moshe saying, don't destroy them. Fine, I won't destroy them. But I'm not going to come down with you because I'll destroy them if I'm there. And Moshe says, I'm not okay with that either. So God says, okay, how about if I build a new relationship? I introduce myself to the Jewish people not as the God of justice, but the God of mercy. Here's my Yud Gimel Midat Arachim, my attributes of mercy. Is that okay? Right? Can we negotiate a new relationship? And finally that works out, and then God says, okay, we've worked that out, let's go back to the Mishkan. Let's pick up where we were, right? Let's actually get the Mishkan. So after building up to that moment of revelation, destroying that moment of revelation at the Egel, and rebuilding it yet again, we get back to the Mishkan, which is, again, that attempt to capture Sinai. And then after all this drama, we get to the end of Shemot, and it works. God's presence descends. But now the question is, okay, it's worked. We have that relationship with God. God has said, I forgive you. I'm going to continue with the original plan. But how does that original plan manifest itself? At the 2 planes that we talked about, right? At the miraculous and intense, and then the mundane. So here, our text says, that's what he calls the double ending of Sefer Shemot. Right, those first 2 psukim, right, that first cliffhanger, and God's presence descended, and Moshe couldn't enter. That picks up 3 psukim later in Vayikra, because Vayikra is a book devoted to primarily the Mishkan. It's the story of the Mishkan. right? Not the story. It's the laws of the Mishkan. It's the description of the Mishkan, right? We almost forget this because, like, in our life, Vayikra takes as much time to read in Shul as Shemot or Bamidbar. But in terms of time, right, if you actually think about time, Breshit takes 2,000 years or whatever, right? Some odd like that. Shemot takes 400 years, 210 years, something like that. However many years they're actually in Mitzrayim, it takes, Vayikra takes a couple of days. Right? Vayikra is almost all law. Like, no time actually passes in Vayikra. I'll catch you up quickly. Right? Though you may have heard parts of this. I don't know. You ever heard the double ending of Shemot's story? Okay, very quickly, and then I'll catch you up. Right? The end of Shemot is a very strange 5 psukim. The first... We'll just talk about the first 2 of these 5. The first 2 of these psukim is, and the cloud of God descends on the Mishkan, and Moshe can't enter. Moshe can't come in. And at that moment you expect a resolution, which is, and Moshe can come in. And then there's a break, and the next 3 psukim are, and when the Anan would lift, so then the Jews would travel. And if the Anan didn't lift, then it wouldn't travel. End of Shemot. And there are 2 storylines that are just hanging here that seem to have nothing to do with each other at the end of Shemot. So Liebtag argues that what's going on is that Shemot is the story of how God built his relationship with the Jewish people. But the relationship with the Jewish people needs to manifest itself in 2 ways. Right? One is in the revelation, intensity, right? Everything that's represented by Har Sinai and then the Mishkan, which according to the Ramban is the continuation of Sinai. And the other is in the mundane, that God is there in the day-to-day, in the yom-yom. So, now we're back where we were. So I think that argues that those stories bifurcate into Vayikra and Bamidbar. Because Vayikra picks up where the pasuk 1 and 2 of that last 5 pasuk unit picked up, right? And if I read it just in order, right, you'll see how you wouldn't even know. If you read it in order and you skipped those 3 psukim at the end of the Sefer, you wouldn't even know there had been a gap. Right? So I'll read it again. Vayichal Moshe the Malacha. Moshe finishes the Malacha in the Mishkan. Vayichas ha'anan et ol moed u'chor le'im alei ha'Mishkan. And the cloud of God covers the Ol Moed, and God's presence fills the Mishkan. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo Ol Moed ki shachan alav ha'anan u'chor le'im alei ha'Mishkan. And Moshe can't enter because God's presence in the Mishkan. And now if I read Vayikra Aleph, Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber el Noel el Lemor. So God then speaks to him. Right? That's what you're expecting. Right there, if you skip the next 3 psukim, it would be a total natural continuation. It literally is the same thing that happened in Har Sinai. There's a presence of God, it's too intense, and then God speaks to Moshe, and then that begins a conversation, and then he invites him in. That's exactly what happens, right? Vayikra picks up right there. And then the next 3 psukim, Uvahalod ha'anan me'al ha'mishkan yisu b'nei Yisrael b'chol ma'aseihem. And when the Anan would lift, the Jews would travel, and if it wouldn't lift, so then they wouldn't travel until it did lift. Because the cloud of God was on the Mishkan during the day, and the fire was there at night, to the eyes of the Jewish people, all their travels, that picks up almost seamlessly in Bamidbar, which begins with a detailed description. Oh, and by the way, what did it look like when they traveled? Well, we had a census, and then we set the Jews up in this very complicated structure with the Mishkan at the center and the four camps on the side of 3 Shvatim each. And then, of course, it picks up in that little 2 psukim in the middle of Bamidbar, Vahi ben Soah, Aaron, Vayomer, Moshe, Kum Hashem, etc. So you see that if Shemot's theme was, how did God get to the point where he developed such an intense relationship with the Jewish people that he now is part of their life in every way, shape, and form? Vayikra and Bamidbar tell you 2 different stories, which is what does that look like? Vayikra tells you the story of what does that relationship look like in its most intense, pristine, concentrated form as manifested in Mishkan. And therefore you get, as I said, a book which takes a course of days, right? Something like 8 days, right? Until maybe the end, right? Meaning it's, right? Most of it is laws, and the only narrative that you have is the narrative of the Miluim, right? And the failure of the Miluim because Nadav and Abihu dies. You have 7 days plus 1 day, but basically the whole book takes like 8 days because it's not a story of life, right? It's a very extensive list of laws of what happens in that concentrated space, right? You're like in suspended animation in Vayikra, right? Like again, we barely notice this. This is one of those things I always try to get my students to notice, is think about Chumash for a moment, not in the way that we read it in Shul, because in Shul, Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, they all give or take, similar amounts of time, a few months to read. But like I said, Bereshit takes 2,000 years, right? Or so. Shemot takes several hundred. Vayikra takes 8 days. Bamidbar is a little bit tricky because it's very tempting. It's tempting and also sort of true that Bamidbar takes 38 years, 39 years. But it's also not true because it doesn't really. It really takes... What?
It skips that.
Right, it really skips 38 years, right? It's really the beginning of that 40-year period and the very end of that 40-year period and no description of what happens in the middle. So it's sort of a period of 38, 39 years, but realistically it's a detailed description of about 2, right? And then Dvarim takes 30 days, right? Because it's just one very, very long shul drasha. Very, very long shul drasha, right? 30 days is long, however you look at it, at least for a speech. For life, it's not long. For a speech, it's very, very long. But you actually get a lot of perspective on what the Torah is doing when you actually take a moment to try to figure out how much time is passing in each book. Vayikra, which picks up on those 2 psukim, is, like I said, it's suspended animation, right? It is almost entirely law, which means no time is passing. Right, you're frozen in space and time as God describes what His most intense relationship with the Jewish people looks like. Right, so about 70% of Vayikra describes the Mishkan, right, the laws of the Mishkan, and the one tragic story that happened when the 2 people, Nadav and Abihu, tried to access God's holiness without following the rules. Right, and God basically tells you, look, if you want to meet me in that holy space, that continuation of Har Sinai, that imminence, that intensity, right, that shul on steroids, then you had better keep a heck of a lot of laws and get it right. Because if you mess with that, right, in this intense moment, it is not going to go well. Right, and that's basically the theme of everything from Vayikra to Achrei Mot. Right, that's almost all of Vayikra. Right, is that intensity, what it looks like, right? What that type of relationship looks like with God. Now, it's not fully true, right? Because the latter third or so of Vayikra transitions out of this very quickly, right? Abruptly. And then, like, after describing all these temple laws, it shifts to Kedoshim and suddenly talks about, right, we have incest laws for 2 chapters that are divided, Yud Chet and Chaf, and then V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha, all these like beautiful laws, love the ger, and then it ends with like Bahar B'chukotai, which is like Shemitah and interest laws, and overcharging laws, right? Not interest laws, overcharging laws, and then the Tochecha, right? Rebuke. So the second half is a little bit weird in this, right? In a nutshell, right? Rav David Tzvi Hoffman argues that the key to understanding Vayikra is in the ambiguity inherent in one word, which is Kohanim. Right, that Chazal refer to Vayikra as Torat Kohanim, but Kohanim in Tanakh means 2 things. It either means literally the priests, or it means the Jewish people, because Vatem Tiyuli Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. Right, so he argues that the thesis of Vayikra is that the purpose of the intense cultic worship of the literal Kohanim in the Mikdash, right, or the Mishkan, is meant to spill outwards and educate and inspire the other Kohanim, being the Jewish people, and that's the second half of Vayikra, right, is Kedoshim Tiyu, right, is if we manage to draw our energy from that intense Mishkan, what it will look like on the national level is Kedoshim Bahar B'chukotai, right? It'll be Shemitah laws, right? Holiness in the whole land, right? And things like that, right? But that's something that has to be explored in Vayikra. But in a nutshell, right, the primary theme of Vayikra is that which ended Pasuk 1 and 2 in this last 5 Pasuk unit, which is God's presence is intense, and one way that we meet God in this world is in the unfathomable, right? Is in the transcendent, imminent mix where we just can't raise the revelation, is the miraculous, and that is Mishkan, and that is Vayikra. That is that suspended animation of a Sefer. But then there's the second side to the story, which is God also meets us out of Shul, out of the Mishkan, out of this intensity in the Yom Yom, in the travels, right? God's, that same cloud that is so intense that Moshe can't enter the Mishkan is the exact same cloud that leads the Jewish people in their travels, right? And that's the story of Bamidbar. It's the story of how we also meet God in life. He literally, right, not figuratively, right? Figuratively is what we talk about normally when we say God when we say God guides me through life, right? He's leading me through life. He shows me what to do. Right? We mean that figuratively, right? In Bamidbar, that's literal, right? God's cloud is literally showing them, where do you go? Right? It's not like when we say, like, I felt a calling to move to Israel. Right? No. God's cloud literally showed them, right? That same intensity, right, was guiding them in their day-to-day. Right? It told them, go south, go north, go west, go east, stay for a week, stay for a day, stay for a year, right? Settle down, don't settle down, right? All those, like, tedious decisions that we make, right? God was literally leading them through those decisions, right? And that's the story of Bamidbar. But all of that, right? And again, it's as if, right? If you think of this as a novel, right? What it is just 2 cliffhangers, right? It's cliffhanger 1. What does it look like for God to actually manifest that relationship He built in the intensity of the Mishkan? Closed book, open book called Vayikra. Cliffhanger 2. What does it look like for God to meet us in the mundane, to lead us through life in the Yom Yom, in the day-to-day? Closed Shemot. Open in Bamidbar. Right? Open in Bamidbar. Right? This is what it looks like. This is what the journey looked like. This is how God led them. This is how God sustained them. This is how they camped. Now, they're not totally disconnected. Or they're not totally disconnected because as Bamidbar opens, they traveled in a encampment around the Mishkan. Right? These aren't meant to be totally bifurcated. That's why, right, they both emerge from Shemot. Right? These aren't 2 disconnected stories. Right? As I mentioned, the second half of Vayikra moves back to the day-to-day, and Bamidbar, as much as it's about travels and mundane, yes, traveling is mundane, but they travel with the Mishkan at their heart. Right? So there is an overlap, and we know that in life, right? Meaning, Shul is one experience of God. You know, the experience of God in the workforce is different, but they are, right? They should be, in an ideal world, influencing each other, right? And playing off each other, right? Those aren't 2 completely different things, even if we think of them in bifurcated ways, right? But they obviously do have some overlap, and that's the way Vayikra and Bamidbar are set up, but they are somewhat overlapping. But they still are 2 stories. And that's what Shemot sets up, right? Shemot sets up these 2 parallel visions of the way that we relate to God, right? And then Vayikra and Bamidbar tell those stories, in German philosophy, this was classically, right? It was classic. They called it typologies, right? If you know anything about philosophy, they love typologies, right? They would take, human personalities are very complicated. So really, we are many different personalities to get right all at the same time. Right? That's the complexity of the human being. But if you want to understand any aspect of a personality, what you need to do is to imagine it as it would exist in its pure form. Right? The Rav used to write this. Right? If you ever, you only understand the right Soloveitchik's works if you realize he's thinking like a German. Right? Because halachic man is not a real person. Right? Halachic man is an element of a Jewish life taken to an extreme. Right? Because that's why Halachic man was originally in the Hebrew was published with 2 books. Right? Because it's 2 books at once. It's Vikashta Misham, which is Ish HaEmunah, is the spiritual man, and then there's the Halachic man, because the ideal Jew in the Rav's head is some synthesis of these 2 theoretical personalities that are brought together. Right? But in order to understand ourselves, right, we need to imagine, right, we need to isolate it. What does this aspect of my personality look like? What does that aspect of my personality look like? And then we look for the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, right? In Hegelian philosophy, right? And that's sort of how the Torah is writing here, right? Is that Shemot begins that synthesis, right? It says, yes, God builds a relationship with us, and it comes to this crossroads where God meets us and has 2 levels, and then we somewhat, right, imagine pure relationships, right? The Vayikra model and the Bamidbar model, right? And then we bring it back together. Right? And again, like I said, there are elements in each book that remind you that they're not pure typologies, right? That these aren't pure. Again, Vayikra ends with Kedoshim Tiyu, right? With regular run-of-the-mill laws, right? Love your fellow as yourself, right? Being the classic example, right? V'ahavta l'recha kamocha is also in Vayikra. Right? And like I said, in Bamidbar, they are encamped around the Mishkan, which is obviously part of the story. But when you take that perspective, you get a better feel for what it is that these books are trying to accomplish, what Shemot is trying to accomplish, what Vayikra is trying to accomplish, what Bamidbar is trying to accomplish. Right? Before you come to the climax of Dvarim, right? Dvarim is this, this final speech is this, massive thing which brings everything together, right? The final speech where it's, this is the message that Moshe wants to leave with the Jewish people. You find all these elements coming back, right? You find him emphasizing the importance of, basically everything you need to know as you build a country in Israel, which is, that's Dvarim in a nutshell, right? It's God describing, or Moshe describing everything you need to know to build God's nation to build a Jewish polity, essentially, a Jewish religious polity. And what you need to do that is a combination of everything from the highfalutin Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which opens Moshe's speech, right, main speech in Perek Hey in Dvarim, to the nitty-gritty of Shoftim v'Shotrim, set up courts, set up, whatever, right? And then in Ha'azinu, Moshe's basically, culminating speech, which summarizes theologically all of human history from the beginning to the end, right? Which is like his, metavision of what the Torah looks like, right? So Dvarim is this, very interesting climactic book, which needs to be studied. On its own terms. Now, the interesting thing in the Haftorah, if we just sort of push it forward in time, is that this journey, as it were, right, that the Jews begin of building that relationship with God and manifesting itself at those 2 levels. When I say that, the Mikdash is the culmination of this process, I don't mean that, I'm guessing, right? I'm not, if you read the Haftarah this week, that's literally what Shlomo HaMelech says, right? Shlomo HaMelech, his language is very clear, right? So the Haftarah, it's from Melachim Aleph, Perek Zayin, and Shlomo sums it up. And he says, one second. Sorry, Perek Chet. It starts in Zion, but Perek Chet, right? When you get this same moment, Batishlam kol hamelacha asher asa melech Shlomo beit Adonai, vayavei Shlomo et kadshei David aviv et hakesef et hazahav et hakelim natan b'otzor beit Adonai. Right? You have that same moment at the end of our parsha, right? Which is Vayichal Moshe et kol melacha, when Moshe finishes. Right? So now this is hundreds of years later, and now Shlomo is finishing the permanent version of the Mishkan. Right? So this is the parallel to the end of Shemot. he gets everybody together and he gives a speech. Right? He gets together the Ziknei Yisrael and the Rashi Hamatot and the Nisei Avot. Vaykalu Melech Shlomo Kol Ish Yisrael B'Yerech Hatanim B'Chag Hu HaKodesh HaShvi'i. And then skipping a little bit, Vayalu and Aron Adonai that all the way that Kol Klei Am Kodesh Asher Ba'Oel Vayalu Otam HaKohanim Elim. He brings the Aron. Right? Literally the whole thing.
Actually, on Sunday I
And then you get in Pasuk Yud, like I said, exactly the same moment you get at the end of Shemot. Vahi b'tzei HaKohanim min HaKodesh V'anan malei et Beit Adonai. Right? They step out after having brought all the kelim, and God's presence descends on the Mishkan. And the Kohanim can't enter. Right? It's the same moment. Right? You bring all the kelim, you finish the work, God's presence descends, and the Kohanim can't enter. Right? It's the end of Shemot all over again. And now Shlomo gives a speech that tells you, in no uncertain terms, that this process, the building of the Mikdash, is the culmination of that process that starts at the beginning of Shemot. Right? Because he says, Az Amar Shlomo, Adonai Amar L'Shkon Barafel, God who was chosen to dwell in a thick cloud. Right? Read Har Sinai. Right? That is like, right? That Arafel. Bano Vaniti Beit Zvul Lach Machom L'Shintachal Amim. I've now built you your home. And then he says, Vayomer Baruch Adonai Elohei Yisrael Asher Diber Befiv et David Aviv V'Yado Milei Lemor, and praise be God who had fulfilled the promise that He made to my father David. Min Hayom Asher Hotzeiti Et Ami Yisrael Mi Mitzrayim Lo Vacharti Va'ir Mikol Shavtei Yisrael V'Not Bait L'Yot Shmi Sham V'Char David L'Yot Al Ami Yisrael. Since Yitziat Mitzrayim, I have yet to pick my city, but now I'm doing it right now. Right? I mean, Shlomo tells you this process wasn't short. Right? This process, right, that culmination of bringing the Jews together, of revealing himself, building that relationship, manifesting that relationship, exploring what that looks like in the Mikdash, exploring what that looks like in real life, bringing it together by building a state, right? Having not just like a Mishkan, which is this like, spiritual floating device in the middle of a desert, right, with no real civilization, no real life around it, but transforming that to the Mikdash, which is in a capital city, right, of a national polity, where those two ideas come together, right, right, that comes to, as Shlomo says, that those two things come together, right. It takes hundreds of years for them to manifest themselves in their most intense form, but that's what the Mikdash is, as opposed to Mishkan, right. The Mishkan is sort of a pure model. The Mikdash, which is also the heart of a political and not just religious capital, right, is that manifestation of both God in the supreme and supernal, and God in the real and the political, in the the day-to-day, right? That comes to the fore in the Mikdash, which is in Yerushalayim, which is the heart of a very practical but also very religious Jewish polity, right? So this story goes from Bamidbar, bifurcates Ve'ekad Dvarim, and then continues for hundreds of years, but comes to the culmination, that final moment that is in our Haftarah when Shlomo brings it all together, and we have.